Good afternoon, welcome. Thank you very much for coming. So this is the second annual Animal Rights Law lecture from the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. My name is Sean Butler and I'm co-director of the centre along with my colleague Dr Raphael Fasel. I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank our donors for the support they give the centre, in particular the Jeremy Collar Foundation, ISAR and the Pitt Watson Family Trust. I want to start by saying I can't emphasize enough the significance of the two people you're going to see and hear today. So Dr Richard Ryder, Dr Peter Singer were literally part of the animal rights movement from the beginning. They coined the language we use. They developed the concepts we employ. They help define the goals that we want to achieve. They laid out a path. Now, that path is proving quite long, and perhaps longer than they imagined in Oxford in the 1970s. And it's still got a good way to go. But while progress is not fast, it is steady. Looking around the room, in 50 years' time, some of you, many of you, will be asked by your grandchildren, so did people really kill animals and eat their flesh? And you'll be able to answer, yes, they did. We did. But people changed. Views changed over time. And I remember going to a lecture in Cambridge by two of the people who started it. 50 years. Yes, I think quite a lot of you are going to make it. So we'll hear first from Dr Ryder, who's going to introduce his friend and colleague, Professor Singer, who will then deliver the 2024 Animal Rights Law Lecture. Now, I'm not sure either of them need an introduction. I will provide one for those of you who are less familiar with their career paths. So Dr Ryder was a student here at Cambridge, first reading experimental psychology at Pembroke College and later getting his PhD in political and social sciences. For 50 years he was an elected trustee of the RSPCA. Several times he was its chairman, and then he was president of the RSPCA for over 30 years until his retirement in 2022. He coined the term speciesism and helped to organise the first academic annual animal rights conference held in August 1977 at Trinity College here in Cambridge. Dr Ryder is the author of a number of books about animal research, animal rights and morality in politics, including Animal Revolution and more recently Painism, a modern morality. And our centre is also very proud to have him as a member of our advisory board. Professor Peter Singer is Ira W. DeCamp Professor of Bioethics in the University Centre for Human Values at Princeton University. Often described as the world's most influential philosopher, Professor Singer became well known internationally after the publication of his groundbreaking book, Animal Liberation, in 1975. And as most of you know, in 2023, he published a fully rewritten and updated Animal Liberation Now, which has been described as one of the most important books of the last 100 years. In 2005, Professor Singer was in Time magazine's list of our 100 most influential people. In 2012, he was made a Companion of the Order of Australia, the nation's highest civic honour. And in 2023, he shared with Stephen Pinker the BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge Award in Humanities and Social Sciences. So I'd now like to invite Dr Richard Ryder to come up and introduce Professor Singer. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to have Professor Peter Singer here today to talk to us about the need for further progress in ethics and law regarding animals and the prospects of achieving it. Thanks very much, Sean, for the kind comments you made. I pointed out 30 years ago that progress in animal protection historically appears to proceed in a series of jerks. Progress seems to be held back in periods of human warfare and/or poverty. So with 2 wars involving Europe today and worldwide economic difficulties, we now have such a period of expected delay, or possibly an opportunity to gather our forces together in order to surge forward again. Progress in animal welfare indeed swept forward in Europe and America from the 1960s, with Britain in the lead to start with. In my opinion, this was because someone called David Wetton and his hunt saboteurs presented such a continuous stream of news stories from 1964 onwards to the present day. Their demonstrations against hunting were continually reported in local and national British media, and the cruelties of fox hunting and otter hunting were publicly exposed for all to see. The alleged interest of the royal family just added further news appeal to the stories of hunt sabotage. In 1969, I was contacted by the writer Bridget Brophy, whom I joined that year on what was apparently the world's first televised discussion of animal rights. And she introduced me to the founders of the small Oxford group of philosophers who were discussing the subject. This group was led by Stanley and Rosalind Godlovich from Canada. Peter Singer then came over to Oxford from Australia and discovered all this interest in the moral positioning of animals. Thank goodness Peter joined us. One day, Peter telephoned me rather out of the blue to ask me about my idea of speciesism. It had come to me a year earlier in my bath as I sought for a new word that would draw the parallels with the treatment of animals and the then recent and very popular words, racism and sexism. I was relieved to discover that Peter quite liked my word speciesism, and I invited him over to tea at Sunningwell Manor, where I was then living. Together, we explored speciesism, and I explained that I was basically a utilitarian. Not without faults, but a utilitarian, basically. I was working as a clinical psychologist in Oxford at the time, while I set about trying to modernize the then reactionary RSPCA. I had already read experimental psychology at Cambridge and done some social psychology at Columbia in New York. I found vivisection in the US even worse than in Britain. Since about 1960, I had formulated and used my own form of utilitarianism, later called by me painism or anti-speciesism, which contradicted Bentham on one point: the aggregation of pains and pleasures across individuals. But I found Peter to be a huge breath of fresh air. He seemed to have a complete mastery of academic philosophy. We've kept in touch ever since. I suppose that's something like 50 years, Peter. Until 1914, the intellectual animal protection movement had had some fine leaders, such as Henry Salt, George Bernard Shaw, Nina, Duchess of Hamilton, and Mahatma Gandhi. Then came the First World War, and the movement ground to a standstill, skillfully derided and undermined by hunters, vivisectors, furriers, farmers, meat producers, and all those who exploited animals generally. Many said we campaigners were being sentimental, emotional, effeminate, and irrational. We were crackpots. That's one reason why Peter is so important. He heads the intellectual movement with formidable, rational argument. He is almost certainly the best-known ethical philosopher in the world today. You may know that in 1960, ethics itself seemed almost to be dead. Indeed, at that time, some educated people were quite unclear as to what the word ethics actually meant. Moral questions were left to priests. It was Peter and a few like him who helped to revive the subject in universities around the world. So animal rights revived not only itself, but the subject of ethics in general. That point is sometimes forgotten today. In Britain, we had too few animal-sensitive lawyers in the movement at that time. American lawyers, however, began to go ahead. But we Brits spent much of the end of the 20th century successfully putting animals into politics. The result was over 50 legislative reforms in the UK and EU between 1970 and 2010. That research was done by David Bowles at the RSPCA. We'd put animals into politics, at least. Admittedly, in doing so, we had more or less bypassed the lawyers. We'd gone straight from reports of abuse to politicians, and thence to new laws. Now we need, as Peter proposes, to put animals further into ethics and the law. I feel that all penient animals of all species should be called citizens. For me, it all goes back to Charles Darwin of this university, whose revolutionary discoveries and their implications are still not being fully lived up to. I think 40 years ago, we needed more help from lawyers, especially academic lawyers. But it's never too late. We need them still if we're going to be able to raise the legal standing of non-humans to approach that of the human animal. 40 years ago, it was perhaps the cruel sport of hunting that kept some of the English lawyers away. Some hated the sport, but others may have liked it a bit too much. It was all rather secret and to do with social class. I agree with Peter absolutely that there is a need for further progress in ethics and the law, and that we smoothly incorporate non-human penients. We need to tidy up some of the loose ends left by Jeremy Bentham himself, and we also need to create a gradual promotion of all creatures who can feel pain. There may be only 1% of entities in the universe who can feel pain, but they are the celebrities, whatever they are, robots, aliens, or animals like us. They need our moral support. Furthermore, we have now put pain and consciousness right into the center of ethics. So I'm glad to welcome my old friend Peter Singer to discuss some of the ways by which we might start to put animals further into ethics and the law. Peter.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to thank everybody who's been involved in organising this lecture, the Cambridge Animal Law Centre. I want to thank Richard Ryder, my good friend, for that very generous introduction that he gave me. And of course, I want to thank you all for turning up, because without an audience, there's not much point in having a lecture. So, we've already seen what we're talking about. Let's go to it. First, let's say, where are we today as far as animal ethics is concerned? I think it's clear that there's a general acceptance that it's good to be kind to animals and to avoid being cruel to them. But, in addition, wanton cruelty in particular is bad. So by wanton cruelty, we mean cruelty that serves no purpose. Somebody who is kicking a cat because they enjoy doing it, or hitting a dog with a stick or a horse. I think we would all object to that. And so that means that we accept that the interests of animals do count. But, here's the but, they don't count comparably to human interests. And in particular, they may be overridden by human interests. For example, our interest in eating them or in using them in research. So, why is that not enough? What else do we need to add? Well, for one thing, the focus on what we might consider wanton cruelty or cruelty as part of a sport is something that is limited to quite a small number of animals. Our culture certainly rejects that. There may be still some cultures that do not reject it, although even where bullfighting is at home in parts of Spain, it's controversial, at least now. But the problem is that this is something that we feel okay about condemning because, of course, it doesn't really affect us. And when we come to something that does affect us, but perhaps causes far more suffering, we do not condemn it. And this is a good example of what I'm talking about. This is intensive chicken production. This is the way nearly all of the chickens raised for meat are produced, in vast sheds with thousands, maybe 20,000 birds in a single shed. And I'll come back to this in a little while and explain to you exactly why there's far more suffering to be seen in this picture than there was in the preceding picture of the bullfight. Okay, Richard has already mentioned speciesism, as I say, a term that I owe to him, and I'm delighted that he had that bath on that particular evening. I came across it in a leaflet that Richard then printed off, just a little one-page thing, a photo of a chimpanzee, you'll remember, with spots over it. This chimpanzee had been deliberately infected with syphilis in order to study something about syphilis, although, of course, humans get syphilis, and we didn't really need to study it in chimpanzees. I don't think we discovered anything by infecting chimpanzees with syphilis. But that's where I first saw the word, across the top of that. And immediately I thought, yes, this is something that has an analogy with racism and sexism, things that at that time were much being discussed and very widely being condemned. Now, I say an analogy. Analogies are never perfect. It's never complete in all respects. But the essential point is that we have a dominant group, a group that is more powerful than other groups. That group at one stage was Europeans, people of European descent, because of their more advanced technology as compared with, for example, Africans. So they could dominate them, and they did, and they enslaved them, they turned them into commodities, they sold them, they transported them in terrible conditions in which many of them died, and they sold them. Similarly, of course, again, there's differences. Men were more powerful than women. Men dominated women. It didn't exactly turn them into commodities, but in some ways there was some parallels there, and they certainly controlled them. In England, for example, once a woman married, she no longer owned property. All the property she had, even if she'd been independently wealthy at the time she married, the property she had belonged to her husband, which of course gave him immense power over her. So here too, with speciesism, we have the dominant group, which in this case is all humans, again because of our technology and our intelligence. We are more powerful than non-human animals, even the lions and tigers. Of course, if they come upon us one-on-one, we are not, but certainly as a species we are. And so we effectively have enslaved them too. We treat them as commodities, literally, legally. Those chickens you just saw were commodities. We pay no real attention to their interests, but only to our own interests. We transport them in conditions in which many of them die, and in the end we kill them. So that's what I think fundamentally underlies the way we're treating animals. That attitude, which we have made some progress in exposing and rejecting racism, not that we've completely abolished it, but at least in terms of law and declarations of universal human rights, we reject it, and the same may be true for sexism, but speciesism is still very much part of the law, for instance, as I said, that animals can be property, and it's an attitude which makes us neglect the interests of other sentient beings. I'm going to distinguish two types of speciesism. The most common and the most important is what we can consider to be anthropocentric speciesism. That's the idea that it's the interests of humans that matter. They matter more than the interests of any non-human, even if they're similar interests. Even if they're, for example, as Richard was talking about, an interest in not feeling pain, and even if we assume that the animal is suffering just as much pain as the human is, we will regard the pain of the human as more important. We'll give priority to stopping the pain of that human. We may not consider stopping the pain of the animal important at all. Although whether we do consider the pain of the animal as important at all may vary according to the second type of speciesism I want to mention, what I call species bias. That is, animals of some species matter more than animals of other species, including their pain and suffering. And that may, for example, mean that we find this picture horrific, much more horrific. These are dogs who've been rounded up and are going to be sold for food. This, I think, picture was taken in Korea. We find this much more horrific than the picture of the chickens that I showed you, or most people do, because these are dogs. Many of us live with dogs. Many of us care for dogs, love dogs, understand that dogs are individuals with their own lives to lead in a way that we don't understand that the chickens are. So we condemn, as I said, the dogs being rounded up. We don't necessarily condemn this in the same way. These are pigs being transported to slaughter. Pigs are just as intelligent, just as much individual personalities, just as much, would do their own thing in the field as they could, if they could. Yet we're treating them here simply as commodities, simply as ways of producing pork or bacon. Okay, just very quickly, speciesism may be just a basic human attitude that comes from the fact that we're omnivores and that throughout our evolutionary history we've taken advantage of the fact that we can digest meat to hunt and kill animals. But it's been reinforced in thought, particularly in the West. And I'll just quickly run through 4 examples of that. There's the familiar verse in Genesis that says, firstly, that God made man in his likeness, and that is not said about any of the other animals God made. So we are made in the image of God, but also we have dominion over them. God explicitly gives us this grant of dominion over them. So that's in the ancient Jewish, Hebrew tradition. In the Greek tradition, we have Aristotle with this idea that the universe is a teleology in which the less rational exist for the sake of the more rational. So plants exist for the sake of animals, and brute beasts exist for the sake of man. And in fact, Aristotle says that the less rational men exist for the sake of the more rational men. Greeks are more rational than barbarians, so Aristotle has here a justification of human slavery as practiced by the ancient Greeks, as well as a justification of a use of animals. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century actually combined the two traditions. He was familiar with Aristotle, and he was also familiar with the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. And he's actually very explicit in saying it doesn't matter how we treat animals. It doesn't matter in itself. So in Aquinas' view, even deliberate cruelty to animals is not itself wrong. It's only wrong if it hardens our nature so that we become cruel to humans. And you can't have a better example of the fact that the animals themselves just don't count. They only count if a practice towards animals, which makes them suffer, also is likely to make humans cause other humans to suffer. And in this verse, he's just quoting the dominion, referring to the dominion verse in Scripture, but he also was aware of Aristotle's teachings on that. And then finally, even in the 18th century, Immanuel Kant says something fairly similar to what Aquinas says. We have no direct duties to animals. They're not self-conscious, he says. So it's our self-consciousness, our higher levels of rationality, perhaps, that makes us special. And because they don't have that, they're merely a means to an end. So again, they don't count in themselves. The end is us humans. So that's very strongly stated views in the Western philosophical tradition, and I could have talked about even more. Could talk about Descartes, who argued that animals aren't even conscious beings. They're just like very complex mechanisms that make noises when you do certain things to them. But the response to, particularly to Kant, I think, was made by Bentham just a little bit later. Bentham said, the question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And I think that's clearly right. That is what matters ultimately. Yes, we may have greater powers of reasoning or use more complex language than other animals, but if they can suffer, then why doesn't their suffering matter? Our suffering matters. Our suffering matters, we think, even if it doesn't affect our capacities to reason or to talk. So why shouldn't the suffering of animals matter? Well, people will refer to these other qualities that I've mentioned, that only humans are rational, only humans are self-aware, only humans are autonomous beings directing themselves, only humans are moral agents, only humans are language users, only humans can take part in a social contract if you're a contract theorist, and so on. So these are all reasons why people have said that we have a higher moral status than they do. Some of these things you could certainly dispute. You could dispute the claim, or you could probably dispute them all, that only humans have these capacities. But that's not really the point. The point is, as Bentham also anticipated this argument, the point is that if we were to take that view, that these are the things that are essential, we would not include all humans in a separate category from animals. We would only include those humans who exhibit those characteristics. And as Bentham says, what else is it that could trace the insuperable line? And if you say it's reason or language, then Bentham points out that are full-grown animals of various species, horses, dogs, wasn't talking about chimpanzees anywhere, whom that would be even more true, but the animals that are quite familiar to English people in his day, is clearly more rational as well as more conversable than an infant of a day or a week or even a month old. And yet we don't regard these humans as only having the same moral status as a non-human animal. So then what would be the right ethical principle? What would be the progress that we need to make ethically to rectify the wrongs that we've done to animals over all of these millennia? And I suggest that it is this. It's a principle of equal consideration of interests, equal consideration of similar interests, that where we have similar interests to animals, they're just as important irrespective of species. That is, for example, an interest in not suffering, not experiencing pain. There's no reason to think that the pains of humans and animals, or some of those pains anyway, might not be very similar. The physical pains. Maybe we can suffer different kinds of emotional pains or grief, although even there we should be careful because, for example, the grief of losing your offspring may well be experienced by other mammals. Any dairy farmer who's honest will tell you that when you take the calf away from the cow, which with dairy cows you always do because otherwise the calf drinks too much milk and you don't get enough to sell, when you take the calf away from the cow shows behaviour very like the grief of a human mother. She calls out for the calf, and even for days or in some cases even weeks, if there was a particular spot where the calf was taken and the cow perhaps passes that spot when being taken to be milked, the cow may call out for the calf. So there's a sense of something seriously wrong there. So where you have similar interests, I would say they should count similarly. Where the interests are different, okay, then you can talk about how you might compare them. Now, if you base this on suffering, as I said we should do, we do have to ask the question, well, do all animals suffer? Which animals are we talking about here? And how do we know that they can suffer? So I think these are three grounds why we may know they can suffer. The anatomical and physiological similarities with us. We can see that. Science can tell us about the fact that many animals anyway, not all, have similar nervous systems, similar anatomy, similar physiology, similar hormones, for example, that are released when stressed. We can see that the behaviour is similar in various ways. We can see that if we walk past a dog and accidentally tread on the dog's paw, the way in which the dog behaves is not very different from how your 6-month-old baby might behave if you accidentally trod on your baby's fingers when you walked past them. So the behavioural parallels can be quite close. And we know that this is not because somehow they are very clever robots that mimic human behaviour, and we're starting to get those clever robots. But this is shared evolutionary history, and it goes back, the development of the nervous system is a common one, so I think we can assume that it's likely to function in similar ways. But as I say, that's not true of all non-human animals. If we're talking about mammals and birds, we can have close similarities. If you're wondering what the sulphur-crested cockatoo is doing, this is an Australian bird that's quite common around the suburbs, and has learnt to identify which bin is likely to have food in it, the ones with the red lid, not the paper recycling, the yellow bin. And they have learnt, although the lid is quite heavy, how to pick it up, get their beak around it, walk down the side of the bin so that the lid flips over backwards, and then they're free to enjoy whatever is in the bin. And of course, we all know that dogs can know quite a lot about us and where we live and what we do. But what about, does this extend to all vertebrates beyond birds and mammals? This is a groper. Again, you know, there's this myth that fish only remember things for 3 minutes. I think it came from the Nemo film. It's complete nonsense. Gropers have very long memories, and they know, you know, people who scuba dive near them. They get to know individual people, and they know who's going to be friendly and who's not going to be friendly. And they're quite long-lived animals, and I think there's little doubt that their nervous systems also can cause them to suffer, and I think that's generally true of fish. A lot of us have now seen the Octopus My Teacher movie, which I think made a number of people stop eating octopus when they realised that it seems that octopus are intelligent beings who also can relate to others, and there's a strong scientific case to that, and also to particular crustaceans, not necessarily all of them, but in the recent United Kingdom Animal Sentience Bill, or Animal Welfare bracket Sentience Bill, both cephalopods, that's octopus and squids, and decapod crustaceans, lobsters, crabs, and some but not all shrimps are classed as sentient beings. So the United Kingdom government now recognises that there are invertebrate sentient beings, recognises that in law, and the EU rules for protecting animals used in research also recognise that. After that point, I think we get to a certain amount of uncertainty. Can insects feel pain? Well, bees have pretty complex behaviour. Bees communicate the location of pollen and nectar in flowers that they can visit by a complex dance. So it's possible that bees can feel pain. Maybe we anyway ought to give them the benefit of the doubt. We certainly can't know that they don't. But if we come to the simpler bivalves, the oysters, mussels and clams, it seems to me less likely. Their nervous systems are much simpler. They're not centrally organised around a brain or anything like that. And also they're not very mobile. If we have evolved a capacity to feel pain in order to move away from danger, it's not clear why these immobile bivalves would have evolved a capacity to feel pain. It's not clear that it would do them any good. So perhaps at that point we can say, okay, it's not all animals we're talking about. These are zoologically animals, but it's only those who are capable of feeling pleasure or pain. Now, given that, let's look at this question of progress that I want to speak about. Where has it been made, and where do we most need to make it? So there are good reasons why a number of people are very concerned about the use of animals in research. Richard, I know, wrote a book called Victims of Science that was a pioneering work on exposing what was happening to animals in research, especially here in the United Kingdom. So this is a serious issue, and the number of animals used in research worldwide is not small. We don't really know exactly what it is because a lot of countries do not keep statistics. Even the United States, amazingly, keeps statistics only on a small range of species of animals used in research, and that range does not include rats or mice, which are estimated to amount to about 95% of the animals used in research, or the vertebrate animals used in research. So we don't really know, but rough estimates suggest that it might be around 200 million. Other estimates suggest it's a bit lower. Compare that with the number of, just talking about vertebrate animals here, raised and killed annually in food production worldwide. It's approximately 200 billion. So as you see, it's about 1,000 times more animals used in food production. And this is not counting wild-caught fish. This is counting animals raised for food. It is counting fish. In fact, a lot of these animals are fish raised in aquaculture, which does cover an enormous number of animals. It's particularly large in East Asia, in China, Korea, and Japan. But it's not only there, of course. So this is this number is really hard to comprehend. It's hard to imagine 200 billion individual sentient beings, far more, of course, than the 8 billion human beings on the planet who are being raised each year raised and killed for food, and often in extremely crowded conditions. So where have we made progress first? Let's look at this first in this area of food production. Well, when I was writing Animal Liberation, the first edition, I talked about the veal industry. The veal industry, which confined, at that time, calves in individual stalls, too narrow for them to turn around, and only large enough for them to move like half a pace forward or backward, and deliberately made them anemic to keep their flesh a pale pink colour, which would get the highest price. That fortunately was banned here in the UK, it's been banned in the EU, and now is not generally used, although it's not illegal in the United States. The American Veal Association recommends that producers not use it. There are still some calves in individual stalls, but the stalls are not as narrow so the calves can turn around, although I think it's just in general cruel to separate calves from their mothers at this early age and keep them alone in particular. But so that we have made progress there. We've similarly with sow stalls, this is a typical sow stall, still being used in some places, but again, banned in the EU, the UK. In the US, it's banned in California and a couple of other states, and its use has been reduced by work of animal organisations who have not been able to ban it nationwide, and I think that's because of the power of the agribusiness lobby and the influence of money in US politics, but have put pressure on corporations, including fast food chains like McDonald's, to say that they will no longer use pig products from producers who use individual stalls for sows. So that's helped, but it's not eliminated sow stalls in the US. Similarly, cages for egg-laying hens. This is perhaps the largest number of animals who've been helped by these reforms that I'm talking about. Again, banned in the EU and the UK, and you're talking probably of something like 450 million hens who have more space because of those prohibitions. And again, in the US, there's been a lot of effort to try to get these corporations to say they will not sell eggs from hens in cages. And that has just now got up to the level at which about 40% of US laying hens are not in the standard wire cages that you see pictured here, but that means 60% of them still are. So that's progress. The slide seems to be a little bit truncated. What the rest of it said was places where we have not made the same amount of progress, we are still raising pigs confined indoors. It was the sows, the breeding sows, who were in these individual stalls, but the pigs themselves, whose bacon or pork or ham people are consuming, are still very crowded and still largely kept indoors. A very boring life for an intelligent animal that needs some stimulation. And as I said, we have this chicken production, which is absolutely huge in terms of numbers, and it's described by Professor John Webster, who founded one of the largest centres for the study of farmed animal welfare in Europe at the University of Bristol. Describes it as the single most severe systematic example of man's inhumanity to another sentient animal. Why? Well, one reason is simply the numbers. Again, we're talking about billions. Worldwide, we're talking about perhaps 70 billion chickens produced by this method each year. But secondly, we're talking about the fact that these birds have, apart from being crowded and stressed because of the crowding, because normally when they're in a small flock, chickens recognise each other as individuals and they keep out of the way of the birds who are more aggressive, dominant over them. But of course, they can't recognise birds as individuals when they're this crowded. So that's one reason for stress from crowding. But also, they've been bred to grow extremely fast. The chickens you find in supermarkets are 6 to 7 weeks old. Really, they're babies. But they're as big as older strains of chickens would have got to in 6 months rather than 6 to 7 weeks. And the effect of that is that they've put on all this weight, but their leg bones are still immature. They're still weak. And that means, according to Webster's studies, that they are in pain, at least for the last 2 weeks of their short lives. They're in pain just standing up because their legs do not comfortably bear their weight. They get foot and leg problems. These problems don't really matter to the producer because they're going to kill them very soon. But when you get like sanctuaries adopting these chickens, if they do let's say maybe there's a fire or something and chickens escape and people take them to a sanctuary, they find that they put on more weight, they're bred to have voracious appetites, and very often they get too heavy and their leg problems mean that they can't walk, they become lame, and you really have to euthanize them. Or they get heart attacks and die because their circulatory system doesn't support their body. So that's part of the reason why Webster is saying this is the most severe systematic example of our inhumanity to another sentient animal. But it is, say, the dominant form of producing chicken almost everywhere. Okay, so that's another area we need to make progress in. And then there's fish production, as I mentioned. Industrial fish production is huge. It's incredibly crowded. There's no attempt at humane slaughter, generally speaking. I think Norway and the Netherlands have started trying some electric stunning for large fish who are being stunned, so for being killed. So for salmon, for example, a salmon farm. But generally speaking, most countries don't do this. And when you have, as I say, smaller species of fish being raised, there's certainly no attempt to do it. So I think there's an immense amount of suffering going on through fish production. And it's only relatively recently that animal organisations have been actually looking at that and saying something about it. It's been sort of progressive. In fact, even when I started writing Animal Liberation, people were saying, oh, you shouldn't really talk about chickens very much. People don't have much sympathy for chickens. Better to talk about cows and pigs. People relate to them better. They have faces that are a little bit more like our faces, and so on. But obviously, we need to talk about chickens. And as we get to know chickens better, we also know that they have individual personalities. Anybody who's had backyard chickens will know that. And now fish, I think, are in roughly the stage where chickens were maybe 40 years ago, where animal groups are starting to turn their attention to them and saying, we have to talk about fish because this is such a large area of animal suffering. And in fact, fish farming for carnivorous fish particularly is an extremely inefficient way of providing food. And not only providing food, actually the suffering is much greater than the suffering of the fish that you see on your plate if you eat fish. So look at salmon, and most of them nowadays are farm salmon, but they're carnivorous fish. So you have to send the trawlers out to catch fish, to catch cheap, low-value fish, often small fish in large numbers. And then you grind them up into fish pellets and you feed the fish to the salmon. The salmon, if a salmon has reached about 4 kilos in weight, one study said that means about 147 fish have been caught, died, suffocated. Again, no humane death, of course, for wild-caught fish, ground up into fish pellets and eaten by the salmon. So it's a hugely wasteful process, and people might say, oh, well, you don't have to worry about eliminating fish stocks because we're farming the fish. But that's not true, of course. You're eliminating other fish stocks at a great rate in order to feed the salmon. And because you're taking those small fish out of the seas, you are affecting the whole ocean ecology, and not only those fish themselves, but the larger ones that depend on them for their own food. Okay, another area where we need progress is in dairy farming, which is not always cows grazing out in the fields. That's what you see, perhaps, as you drive around the countryside. But what you don't see is this. This is an English dairy farm. And in fact, I just sort of quick bit of searching found this online. It's not an undercover video taken by animal activists. It's basically a informative video taken by the farm. You get the farm's owners speaking about their method of production and saying that these cows never go outside. They're permanently fed indoors. They're confined. And as I said, of course, their calves are taken away from them. So I think we need to think about the dairy industry as well as it moves to more intensification. This is still, by American standards, relatively small. I think it had 1,600 cows, they say. That's large for a dairy producer where the cows go outside, but not otherwise. And, in the United States, there are dairy farms with 10,000, 15,000 more farms. There was one in the news in Texas last year because a fire swept across the fields and burnt the entire intensive dairy farm. 18,000 cows were burnt to death in that fire. So people realise, oh, there are dairy producers that have 18,000 cows. So let me just say that all of this food production that we're talking about has a lot of other reasons for objecting to it. Environmental impacts, of course, animal production, especially the cows and sheep, produce methane and make major contributions to climate change. They damage the environment because of the concentrated manure and pollution that comes off with that, a lot of it often getting into rivers and polluting them. And it's not good for our health. This is a report by a commission that was set up by Lancet, the leading British medical journal and one of the top 2 medical journals in the world, which recommends that we should eat a diet rich in plant-based foods with fewer animal-sourced foods, and that will improve both our own health and bring environmental benefits. So To summarise on intensive animal production, which is the area that I'm focusing on where we need to make more progress, it involves a vast amount of suffering for animals. It reduces the amount of food available for humans, whether you're talking about calories or protein, by both measures. There's more going in than it comes out. In some cases, like feeding grains to beef cattle, by a factor of about 10. Increases greenhouse gas risks and also increases pandemic risks. These crowded sheds full of animals are an ideal breeding ground for new viruses, and we're seeing that. We're getting that. We had swine flu, the epidemic before COVID, and now we're getting avian flu, bird flu, H5N1, which is now spreading to other mammals and to humans as well. So I think we should be working to make this illegal, to make it illegal to confine animals all their lives indoors. I just want to say a little bit about law, as this is a Law Centre lecture. We have made some progress in law, and again, I think this is particularly in the EU and the United Kingdom as well. In the EU, there was this incorporation in the Fundamental Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, 2009, the Lisbon Treaty. Article 13 says that all of the Union and the member states recognise animals as sentient beings, pay full regard to the welfare requirements of animals while respecting the legislative or administrative provisions and customs of the EU countries. Now, pay full regard to the welfare requirements of animals, they are clearly not doing, since, for example, the chicken farming that I showed you is in all EU countries. There is this kind of let-out clause, and I'll leave it to the lawyers here to talk about how you might interpret that. But I would have thought that there's an opportunity to bring cases of violations of this. But again, that's just looking at the language of this. It seems that this should be making more of an impact than it has made so far. Now, in the UK, as I said, just a couple of years ago, there was the Animal Welfare Sentience Act that recognised animals as sentient beings. This was something that Boris Johnson promised to those who said, oh, but if you take us out of the EU, animals won't have the status of sentient beings anymore. And he said, all right, we'll legislate to make sure they do. And that was one of the promises that he did keep. But it remains to be seen what the effect of the Act is going to be. It sets up an Animal Sentience Committee to do this, report on whether the government is having or has had all due regard to the ways in which the policy might have had an adverse effect on the welfare of animals as sentient beings. So the Animal Sentience Committee has now been appointed, but it remains to be seen how it does its work and whether there could be legal remedies on that if the government disregards the advice taken. And the third, and I think the last of these that I want to look at, is the idea of incorporating a somewhat different version of sentience into a country's constitution. As the UK doesn't have a written constitution, I guess this is not something that's going to happen here quite in that form. But Belgium just did this just last month, and I thought it was quite a significant achievement. Firstly, it required a 2/3 majority of the House of Representatives, the lower house of the Belgian Parliament. And it's interesting that that majority was forthcoming. And secondly, it seems to be stronger in its language than the treaty that I referred to before, because it says in the exercise of their respective powers, the federal state, the communities and the regions, so Belgium is a sort of federal area with 3 regions, ensure the protection and well-being of animals as sentient beings. That's pretty strong. And I hope that there will be legal action taken on the basis of this. This was passed through the vigorous work of Belgian animal organisations, especially Gaia. So I imagine that they will be onto this and trying to take legal actions to advance the protection of animals under this new constitutional provision. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to take questions or comments on what I've been saying.